Now, Professor Niall Winters' research is looking at the use of technology in education and training globally, and Professor Winters has been very involved in establishing a new global centre at Kellogg, at the University of Oxford, but at Kellogg on global healthcare and urbanisation, because increasing numbers of the population in the world are living in urban areas, and a lot of our fellows and students are researching sustainable urban development. So there is a strong link between the two talks on that, as well as technology. And Niall is obviously a much better place to explain than me, but he's looking at the use of technology in training for global healthcare and international development. So Professor Niall Winters.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to Kellogg and the whole organising team. Thanks to Therese for an excellent lecture. Thanks to Joanne, as well as Head of Department, for her support over the years. Thanks also to my partner, Anne, and my family. My mum and my sister are here today. Thanks for coming. And my dad passed away earlier this year, so just like to remember him today as well. So I'm going to talk about technology in global healthcare training. Reflecting on a couple of projects, recent projects mainly in Kenya and East Africa. So I like this image of the African continent. Can you see how huge it is, how vast it is, how much opportunity there is there? And I don't know if you can read this very well. I should have a pointer here somewhere. Does it work? Yeah, so this is China. This is the United States. This is just Eastern Europe here, Italy, France, Spain. So you get a sense of the vastness of the continent, which is often underestimated on some maps we might see. So although huge opportunity, on the other hand, a high global burden of disease. So look at the number of orange to red countries there. And so thinking of that, or keeping that in mind, what exactly do I do? What's my research about? So if we want to address this global burden of disease, one of the key ways of doing that is strengthening the healthcare workforce, right? Be it community health workers, who mainly I work with, who would be volunteers, often volunteers, working in rural and urban communities, often with the most underserved. Again, we work with nurses, we work with doctors, and we're very interested in, or I'm very interested in, the role of technology, particularly innovative technologies, as they develop in the training and supervision of healthcare workers. And that's what I'm going to focus on the majority of this talk this evening. Okay, and so this focus on marginalization, or people who are marginalized by the system, sort of takes two forms, really, most recently. It's an empirical examination of health worker practice. So what's actually going on in these contexts, and how can, and if technology can help. And in particular, we've done some work recently with Anne as well, focusing on mothers of children with disabilities and their experience of the health system, and sort of how training of health workers can then better support their needs. And that leads to sort of a more fundamental academic, if you like, rather theoretical rather than empirical research on theoretical developments in mobile learning or technology enhanced learning. Work more recently on the personalization of learning, so how to make learning and learning using technology more meaningful, I guess, to you as a learner, and using artificial intelligence techniques to do that. And then thinking more globally about the field, thinking about the ethics underpinning what we do. And that's sort of our most recent work. So all of this should come together basically with the aim to improve community health worker training programs that use technology. Okay. Given that background then, who are community health workers, right? So these are some of the people we work with in country, in Kenya, right? Some are supervisors, so there would be nurses, often supervising or mentoring or holding accountable, depending on your perspective, often 50 community health workers, right? And they've been doing this using pen and paper, often at a distance. And we became interested a few years ago with the growth of mobile phones, for example, how might mobile phones help them do supervision in a more supportive way? And I say we because we kind of brought a lot of people together over the years. I tried our best to. thanks to some of the funders who are mentioned here as well to help us do this work. We'll try our best to get the funding to get it done. And also the people. If your name isn't on this slide, I sincerely apologise, but I tried my best. I really tried. So yeah, you don't need to read this, but just to show over the years, it's really this idea, I guess, of the professorship is actually not my work. It's about the work of whole teams of people that have come together over the years. So the process, if we go back now, where did this all start? And I don't know if this is obligatory in most inaugurals, but a little bit of an embarrassing photo. So that's me there, and a colleague at the time, Jose Gaspar. Does anyone know what that is? Wow. It's a robot, basically. So I used to work on semi-autonomous robotics years ago, and using computer vision, we developed our own cameras back when I actually had hair. So how did I move for that? And actually, real thanks should go to Professor Richard Noss from the UCL Knowledge Lab, who kind of took a chance on this guy a few years later to say, hey, you've got a background in technology and computer science, you've an interest in education, you know what, I'll take a chance on you. And I'm ever grateful for that and for sending me on the path to the work I do now, going back to what I was talking about earlier. So sitting in contexts like this, recommendation if you're ever running or involved in international development projects, giving teams T-shirts is always a huge motivational factor. People like to be seen as part of a community. Okay, so here's some of the community health workers, again, we work with in various urban and rural settings. And so you get interested in things like WHO guidelines around how to optimize, in their terms, community health worker programs and how to do that using technology. You see, these are two different documents. I'm really interested in the intersection between those two. Right? So you could say, bringing that sort of old robotics or that idea of what technology can do, how it can be used in education training within the context of global health. And I don't have time to go into it in detail here, but we take a social justice approach to development. And you can think about doing international development in different ways, but just thinking about social justice. So that's essentially saying people who are marginalized are more deserving of support, so they should get preferential treatment. Okay? And taking that perspective and applying it to the design of training and supervision programs in the context I've talked about can lead, or at least for this presentation, led to these three questions, right? So the first, if you're thinking about a community health worker, training 50, 100, 200 community health workers, what area of health are you focusing on? And going back to the global burden of disability that I showed at the map at the beginning, is that a neglected area of health? Because you want to really engage with the most marginalized. We've heard a lot, I think, in this community, in this room, we know a lot about educational theory, learning theories. Okay, and so we want to think about the programs that are existing, thinking about what we want to do, what learning theories, underpin them, and are they appropriate? Okay, and once you've done that, then you want to start thinking about the technology. Okay, and really think about how it can be used in a beneficial way. Okay, you're not doing technology for technology's sake. Okay, and if you bring these, so what I'm going to do is answer these three questions for the duration of the talk. So, does the community health program focus on a neglected area of global health? And we focused on one area in particular, and that was disability. Okay, and so we looked at essentially what was going on in East Africa, and I won't go into the details here, but essentially there's not much green on this on this heat map here. Okay, there's a lot of yellow, there's a lot of red. That means there's not a lot of work going on in this area. It's neglected. What does that mean at the kind of the coal face, if you like? It means mothers of children with disabilities are not getting the support they need. Okay, so the community health workers not been trained appropriately to be able to address their needs. These are some women from Nairobi who have children with, many of them children with cerebral palsy. So the question is, how do you help? How do you train community health workers, excuse me, to help these people? Okay, and that involves a lot working with, looking at what community health workers are currently doing. Okay, mapping the situation, seeing what's going on, going into the communities. Okay, both rural and urban. Okay, mapping the lay of the land, if you like. And with apologies to anyone who can do better network diagrams, this is just using PowerPoint. Essentially what that leads to is a mapping of a system and the actors within that system, okay, including people, including resources, including technologies, okay? And then you can think about where might, for example, mobile technologies fit within this context, okay? So you do these kinds of exercises first. So moving on then, you've done your mapping, you've defined an area of global health that you're working in, and now you begin to think about, okay, what learning theories are appropriate? And obviously we all build on the shoulders of others, so you go off, you do your scoping or systematic reviews, map the evidence, etc., right? And although the situation's got better in the last few years, what you tend to find out is there is a preference often for technologies that scale really well. But from a learning point of view, that essentially means didactic approaches to learning. So here is a system where people essentially listen to audio recordings, okay? And they're being trained, if you like, by listening to this. This is doing something similar with video on a mobile phone, okay? So there's no real investment in looking at changes in practice over time as a result of this, for example, okay? There's also been people who've looked at supervision. So we became very interested in supervision and how the nurse or the supervisor working in a district health centre supports and supervises the community health workers in their location. WHO guidelines, or WHO did some work at this and looking at supportive supervision and what it should look like. Okay, so I don't need to go into this in detail, but ensuring supervisors receive adequate training, ensuring appropriate supervisor to supervisee ratio, for example, right? And the evidence for this was very low. Okay, so they weren't seeing a lot of this. Even though if you go back and look at other reviews, they say that when community health workers get this kind of support, they tend to do a really good job. So there's a gap here, and this is without technology. And so coming back to theory, I won't go into the whole detail of it. You don't need to know what this, the point to be able to read this diagram, but essentially it's Diana Laurillard's Conversational Framework, right? And what it's trying to do is map engagements or conversations, if I put it this way, between teachers and students or supervisors and supervisees, right? What needs to happen in order to engage in productive dialogue around something you may be thinking, so wanting to learn about, okay? And so we're like, okay, this could work. We'll think about, could we use this? This is moving us far away from this didactic view of learning, okay? And you need some good content to what are people talking around. Richie's talked about ancillary objects to think with, right? So what are actually people going to have a dialogue about, or community health workers going to have a dialogue around? And in our case, going back to disability that I mentioned earlier, excuse me, it's about, from their point of view, doing assessment of childhood development, right? So understanding how they assess the needs of these young children, for example, that we showed in the photo earlier, okay? And turns out that the Liverpool School had done some work on this, on tools to enable this assessment, but it was paper-based. So now if we start putting these things together and start thinking about what we know about supportive supervision, okay? So as educationalists, we know, oh, sorry, hit the wrong button. Yeah, we know how to do this kind of thing, right? But it's really about talking about that map I had at the beginning of all the logos, etc., bringing people together with the necessary expertise to enable doing something innovative around this, okay? And that's what we tried to do in Kenya, and I'll show you some of the results from that work. And this idea of supportive supervision, James O'Donovan, one of her PhD students, DPhil students, is extending that work in Uganda at the moment. Okay, so now you've done that. So you've done I've answered, or hope I've answered the first two questions. Okay, and now we go on to think about the technology or technological innovation. Okay, and I'll focus on mobile, then I'll talk a little bit about work led by Chris around virtual reality and nurse training, and then go on to talk about the latest stuff we're doing with artificial intelligence around the personalization point I made earlier, right? So we've probably all seen these kinds of graphs, right? And this is broadband subscriptions per 100 people, and this one is mobile, okay? So on the left broadband, on the right mobile. And I'll just pick the red line on this one. Let me just double check. Yeah. So if you see the blue line here is Kenya. Okay. So it's fairly low, right? Whereas if you look at, sorry, I'm not very good at reading the colors. Green here, I think is Kenya there, right? And above it is China, right? So much better mobile penetration, right? Than if you look at bog standard broadband, right? And so you might want to think to yourself, hey, people have access to tools. It's growing It's growing all the time. Let's think about using mobile. Okay. Problem is, with apologies to Larry Cuban, around tech in schools, right? There's an awful lot talked about technology, and technology is an agent of change, right? And he had this great book called Oversold and Underused, right? And so what you need to think about is not only a sort of a technocentric view of, so here's Bill Clinton and a few other luminaries talking about how technology, so for example, Bill Clinton, mobile phones are the most effective advancement in history to lift people out of poverty. No, they're not, right? And so you're in a field, right, where there's lots of these wild claims been made. So you need to come with this criticality to how you're designing these technology-based interventions, right? And there's lots more. TED has lots of talks that you can be quite critical of. So you go back to the community. You go back to the community health workers we saw earlier in the talk, and you work with them to iteratively develop your iteration, whether it's mobile, whether it's the virtual reality work that we're doing with Chris. And you can do this in a number of ways, using things like photo elicitation, for example, workshops. Going back to the mapping of practice we saw earlier, it all begins to come together in the iterative design, right? And so what we then developed was a mobile tool, iteratively over about a year. And this is my rather pathetic attempt at a visualization of what was actually going on. So here we have a mobile phone with the supervisor using it, right? Underpinned by the learning theory I talked about earlier, with the tool for doing assessment I talked about, right? And it's got some nice software architecture underpinning it. Computer scientists, I can't really ignore that. And here are all your community health workers using them, okay? And you look at what's happening, right, as people are engaging. So as the community health workers are out doing their job, now assessing what's going on. How far are they getting through it? How much data is being collected? How are they making decisions about the children who need referral or not, right? And all this is collected and visualized for the supervisor, right? And then you follow up. You do all your good methods, time diaries, exactly. You follow technology through a system. We know about things like interpretive flexibility, for example. And really engaging and seeing how this develops, further workshops, etc., with people, okay? Both urban and rural. Hopefully this loads, right? So a lot of sort of sitting under trees as well in nice weather, which I have to say is very nice if I can look out the window today, right? And bringing our community health workers together, okay? And essentially looking at what's going on here, okay? But when we were doing this project, WhatsApp became really popular in Kenya. So we're thinking, okay, how do we leverage this as well? So we're not just talking about building our own technologies, we're also talking about how we can, in a productive way, think about using technologies that are widely available. Okay, and then you go out and you've got these tools. The community health workers are going out doing their assessments. So this is a community health worker here, been trained on using the mobile app I showed you. We did work in Kibera, and here is one of the houses and the community health worker assessing this child here. Interesting, I put this photo here, again, one of our community health workers, just to make the point that technology isn't replacing what's going on, okay? So a lot of the resources are on the phone here are also on paper, because he likes to study. When he's studying his assessment and the steps to go through it, he'll do that on pen and paper, right? So you think about how these technologies come together, okay? And I just thought I'd take one quote to highlight what's going on here, okay? And one of the supervisors had said, from using the app, the one that I showed in yellow, you are really able to understand the practices of community health volunteers, as they're called in Kenya, in the households. Okay, so this is a supervisor really trying to understand what's going on. Okay, we're interested in how they, that's the community health workers, come to their decisions in the household. The application gives them the opportunity to actually document this. With paperwork, it is really hard for you to gauge what steps did the community health volunteers follow for them to make a certain decision, for example, around referral. And where this is working towards, or what the supervisors were saying, is that they now understand the challenges of, for example, a novice community health worker trying to make decisions, okay? And therefore they can better tailor their supervision to the needs of that community health worker that they couldn't do when they were using pen and paper, right? So from the app, they have a series of questions, i.e. the protocol they're following, which I can look at, and when they make a decision, I can be able to infer those decisions from what they filled in the app, okay? So it's a change in supervisory practice, and it can only really happen because of the way we designed or co-designed the technology-based intervention. There's a number of other things, but I just thought I'd highlight that one. And the other one I mentioned, WhatsApp, and I mentioned ideas of supportive supervision, so you can go back and you can analyze what's going on in your X many thousand messages, I can't remember how many it was now. And you can think about what aspects of supervision are coming through in those messages, right? It's usually a lot around the more supportive side of supervision. I tend to think a little bit like the app and the doing the assessments a bit like the lecture, and the WhatsApp a bit like the pub, and the different nature, different conversations happen because of the different technologies we're using. Okay, so thinking then and building on this idea, if you're thinking about scaling this, so we were only working with about 250 community health workers and supervisors or so over the years. What happens if you want to do the whole of East Africa or even the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa? Who knows? Are there ways of thinking about analysing and looking at this data through using artificial intelligence techniques, okay, and beginning to augment or support what the supervisors in this case are doing, right? And some of these ideas builds on work that, for example, Rich and Celia did in the MyGem project, for example. But again, we find ourselves in this world a bit like I talked about mobile phones a few years ago, where AI has been promoted as this kind of great savior, AI for good, for example. Right? But luckily, simultaneously, there's a lot of critique, which I guess many of you know about. And for example, critiques of data surveillance and what's actually going on here, right? So you want to think about very carefully about how you're using this data, right? And the ways in which you can do that in a productive way. And the way I see this, I'll come back to this in a second, is thinking about, if you like, AI for all, right? So if you think from a social justice point of view, for example, why shouldn't a community health worker have the kind of personalised support that, for example, a student here may have, right, using the underpinning techniques of artificial intelligence, right? And we're saying, well, yes, they should, okay? But they may not have a big data institute down the road and 2 million or 5 million images from the NHS, for example, right? So what can you do? Well, it turns out that many of the big tech companies, Google, etc., have now lots of essentially open source libraries. This one's called TensorFlow Lite, okay, and TensorFlow.js, right? Which means you can build AI techniques that, when I was back doing robotics, I spent months and months coding, right? That are now 2 lines of code in a library, right? So you can bring in nice techniques, right, on a phone without any internet connection. You're not dealing with privacy issues because the data never leaves the device, and it runs in a browser. So you can do everything on the phone, right? And that's essentially what this little image is trying to show. It's some of the data and the techniques you can use to engage with it, or AI techniques, right? And this is relatively early stage work in the last sort of 6 months or so. And then with Anne, we've kind of been doing little pilots. This is funded by the Wellcome Trust, seeing what we can do with mobile phone technology, with this AI technology. And so this is a dermatological app. You may have heard of this kind of thing before, where this is doing essentially looking at images of nails. And it turns out that images of nails can be a sign of more systemic or more serious disease, right? And this is using AI techniques to basically assess. There are more gory nails, but I thought I'd spare you all that. But essentially, it's a proof of concept where you can take a photo. And we're interested in what nail technicians can do with this, for example, who are another group who would not be a core, a bit like a community health worker. They're not essentially seen as a core to the health system, I guess. They're not nurses, they're not doctors, right? And this one runs offline and runs in the browser and can recognize and give recommendations about what you want to do, right? So you could then think about, okay, if we can do this with mobile phones, right? We can perhaps do this with virtual reality. And so Chris, who's sitting in the audience, leads a project looking at the development of, do you want to wave, Chris? I see some people looking for you over there. Essentially developing simulation-based training, right, in virtual reality. Again, because very well-equipped teaching hospitals, for example, in Nairobi, won't have the kind of simulation or mannequin-based training that the NHS has, because it costs a serious amount of cash, both in resource and in healthcare workers' time. So Chris and the team, and we've been working on building, this is one scenario, this is neonatal resuscitation. So nurses often working end up working in rural health centres, have done training in one of these in Nairobi, in one of these well-equipped hospitals, right? And so we're thinking about virtual reality technology getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. Can you build simulation-based VR? And this is called the Light Project. It turns out you can. But now if you think about, okay, how do we again begin personalizing the learning experience? So as nurses are working through the protocols to resuscitate the newborn, can we provide support? A bit like Siri, essentially, right? So if they're asking questions going through the neonatal resuscitation protocol, we can recognize what they're saying and provide them with personalized answers. Again, just using this standard AI, right? We're not thinking about resources like, for example, the Big Data Institute would have. And again, that's ongoing work. Okay, so I've kind of focused on the community, on the individuals, and the need to focus on training. Okay, and so if we step back a little bit, okay, and think about the agenda, what's going on here in terms of global healthcare training, right? There's two things I want to focus on briefly. One is developing the evidence base, okay, and the second one is examining the ethical basis of what's going on here. Okay, so I talked earlier about doing various, scoping, systematic reviews, etc., which is all well and good, right? We all need to do it. We see what's out there, but engaging with policymakers or engaging with non-academics, particularly in the NGO sector, is challenging. They don't have the kind of time we have to sit reading research papers, and so we've been working with a former PhD student of mine, Lawrence, who's now at the University of Johannesburg, and there they have an Africa Centre for Evidence. And essentially what this is doing is visualizing the evidence base that underpins these kinds of papers, okay? So people can dive in, there's a link there, I guess when the slides are shared, you'll be able to go and have a play with this, right? And immediately the visualization, you can see what's working. So this is here, for example, on-the-job aids or tools in maternal and child health. There's a decent bit of work going on there, right? But if you go over here around mental health and disability here, not that much, right? Going back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. And you can click on any of these, see the papers, go into them, right? But also what's interesting about this is not just the tool itself, but the evidence network you build around it. So who's having conversations about the evidence? What counts as evidence? What's included? What isn't? Right? And so we've been doing a little bit of work on that, on the nature of evidence that's included in scoping reviews, for example. Right? And this is sort of a starting point for engagement with non-academic audiences. Okay. The second part of thinking more globally is looking at the ethical positioning of what we do, right? And this is ongoing work. So, but my feeling is, and kind of where the research is taking us at the moment, is that essentially there's a utilitarian view in digital health, right? So this idea of maximizing access for everyone is key. You see that with the projects with scale, for example, right? So how do we get these, for example, didactic-based training tools into as many hands as possible, right? And there's a strong motivation within the community for doing that. However, you can kind of ask another question, right? Going back to the photo, for example, of the mothers with disabilities, how does that really help people who are already highly marginalized? And you can flip the question and say, actually, we'd rather take what's called a prioritarian view or a preferential option to say, actually, we're going to change what we do and going to focus what we do to your need, okay? And we're going to target extra resource to do that. And that's part of the underpinning reason of why the applications I've been talking about were developed in the way they were, okay? It turns out there's not that many people who think that way. And so we're trying to do a bit of work to say actually forming the foundational ethical basis of the field going forward. And we'll hopefully, fingers crossed, we're in the corrections phase of a paper at the moment to get that out. So I'd like to end, I guess, by thinking back over what I've talked about and the kind of underpinning ideas, if you like. And I've tried to summarize them here under these five headings, right? So one is thinking about the normative value of what you do, right? So healthcare as a human right is one of the ones we're coming from. It underpins pretty much everything we're doing. More pragmatically then, thinking about the need that's out there, right? So turns out that particularly around community health, there's going to be a real dearth of trained community healthcare workers, right? So we need to get our act together and do more of the kind of work we're doing. So if there's any master's students around in the audience thinking of doing, DPhils or PhDs, it's a nice, nice world to get involved in, right? And that estimated shortage is around 14 million by 2030. Okay, so what does that mean for example, the mothers I showed at the beginning of the talk? You need to have a critical understanding of technology, right? Technology is not going to be your agent of change, going back to the Bill Clinton quote, for example. It's socially constructed in everyday practice, okay? The social scientists here will know what I'm talking about when I talk about that. Second last, I'd say, been very pragmatic, okay? If you're working with the most marginalized, right, and you're thinking about how do we engage with health systems, people are marginalized because the system marginalizes them. And if you're engaging with people who are marginalized, you're showing up essentially weaknesses in that system. And then you're potentially going to policymakers or people in the ministry and saying, hey, you need to change what you're doing here. But actually, they may think things are going pretty well. They'll look at maybe maternal and child health, for example, HIV, AIDS, water and sanitation. They'll look at those, they'll look at the policy documents and say, hey, look what we've written, look what's going on here. We're doing good stuff. Yes, they are, but then you get into the relationship between, let's say, research and advocacy. And I'll just park that one there. And essentially what I've tried to do is bring three things together in the talk. The narrative about, for example, talking about the community healthcare workers, talking about the supervisors, talking about the mothers of children with disabilities. The data, or the evidence base, if you like, your scoping, systematic reviews, etc. And then moving towards action, right, which was around, at least the starting point, those visualizations I talked about and the nature of building evidence networks, okay? And you want to kind of be bringing all of these together. And so I would say, if you're interested in knowing more, a little plug for an upcoming edited book by Anne, James, Laura and myself, bringing together a lot of work that's going on in community health It's going to be called Community Health Work as a Pedagogical Perspective, or it is today. OUP might help us with an updated title on that. Okay, it's not exactly catchy, is it? I mean, and so what I'd like to end with here, sort of reflecting back on the journey to becoming a professor, and really talking and thinking about the PhDs and DPhil students I've had over the years, and sort of where they started in the late 2000s and into this year, and where they are now. And we've hopefully 4 more to complete this in early 2020, right? And it's a real, excuse me, journey. And so I think all of them can be where I am in a very short space of time. So thanks, everyone.